helps us understand what he's really dealing with. That he's trying to calm down and he's choosing that road before surgery. It's a smart thing to do, even if he's missing a couple slams.
3 weeks. That is all the runway Alcaraz has left. Now a tennis expert warns of something worse than rust. His wrist recovery may have created a serve problem nobody has measured. Entry lists for New York went public this week. Alcaraz appears there as reigning champion, ranked 3rd. Zverev leads him by 320 points. Sinner floats nearly 5,000 clear of the German. 4,800 points vanish during the absence. Another 3,000 disappear unless he wins Cincinnati and repeats in Flushing Meadows. Recovering that haul demands deep runs at both venues. Nobody survives 2 hard-court fortnights without a dependable first ball. Qualifying opens on the 11th of August. 2 days later, the main draw starts. He has not struck a competitive ball since April, which returns us to the alarm raised earlier this month. Greg Rusedski studied rehab footage and found a hole in it. The Spaniard climbed into complete service motions, landed, then let the ball fall. Contact never arrived. 100 days of that pattern rewires timing. Subscribe before Ohio begins, because the answer arrives out in public. Here is why that single missing shot frightens everyone who understands wrist injuries. Rusedski watched that footage the way a mechanic listens to a struggling engine. He was not searching for beauty. He was hunting for the sound that ought to be present and is missing. What he found, he laid out plainly on his podcast. The Spaniard was striking light forehands and equally light backhands, barely touching the ball, moving through patterns instead of playing tennis. Then arrived the observation that circled the globe within hours. Across the service portion of the session, Alcaraz never once made contact. He rose into the motion, came down, allowed the ball to fall, and began the whole sequence again. Releasing a clip like that, Rusedski suggested, buys publicity and very little beyond it. His verdict was sharp enough to trend for a full week. He would be shocked to see Alcaraz at Flushing Meadows. Hold that image steady, because it deserves far closer inspection than social media gave it. A serve is not a single movement. Roughly 7 separate actions are stitched together inside a second and a half, and the wrist enters the equation only at the very end of that chain. Loading begins in the legs, rotation follows through the hips and trunk. External rotation drops the racket head behind the back. The arm accelerates upward, and then, in the last fraction before impact, the forearm pronates violently, rolling the racket face across the ball while the wrist snaps through to deliver spin and speed. That final piece is precisely where the tendon sheath sits. It is where pain would announce itself instantly. Everything preceding it can be rehearsed all afternoon without any risk whatsoever. Worth pausing on the diagnosis itself, since most coverage skated past it. Tenosynovitis describes inflammation of the protective sleeve surrounding a tendon rather than damage to the tendon fibers. Think of a cable running through a lubricated tube. When that tube becomes irritated and swollen, the cable no longer glides cleanly, so movement produces friction, heat, and eventually pain. Mild presentations settle within 4 to 6 weeks under rest, immobilization, and anti-inflammatory treatment. Chronic versions, where the sleeve thickens and the irritation becomes self-sustaining, can drag well beyond 3 months. Alcaraz has now been sidelined for over 90 days, which places his case firmly in the second category regardless of what any statement claims. That timeline explains the caution far better than any conspiracy theory circulating online. It also explains why a specialist might declare the structure healed while simultaneously restricting the one action that stresses it hardest, which means a player under strict medical instruction to avoid impact would behave exactly the way Rusedski described. Rehearse the chain, skip the collision, land safely, reset, and repeat. That is not proof of a broken serve. It reads far more like a protocol being obeyed. Here is the harder truth though, and it cuts in a direction most reaction videos never explored. Rehearsing a motion you never complete does carry consequences over weeks, just not the consequences people assume. Timing degrades long before power does. A serve is fundamentally a rhythm problem wearing the costume of a strength problem. The ball toss, the leg drive, the exact moment the racket drops behind the shoulder, all of it is calibrated by thousands of repetitions that end in contact. Remove the contact and you delete the feedback loop, keeping that calibration honest. Muscle memory survives. The internal clock quietly drifts. The question worth asking then is not whether Alcaraz can still hit a serve hard. He almost certainly can. What matters is whether he can place one on a line at 4-all in a deciding set against somebody who has been competing without interruption since January. That distinction becomes enormous once you understand what he built and what he now stands to lose. Cast your mind back to New York last September. The final against Sinner produced numbers that read like a printing error. 61% of first serves landed, which is unremarkable by itself. 83% of those points won, which absolutely is not. 10 aces, 0 double faults. Across the fortnight, he was broken only 3 times and surrendered a single set in the entire tournament, that one coming in the championship match. The wider season told an identical story through different figures. He struck 463 aces during 2025, climbing from 265 the year before, an increase approaching 200 inside 12 months. Patrick Mouratoglou identified 2 technical adjustments underpinning the change: a higher right leg lift during the toss and deeper extension of the left arm after contact. Both feed relaxed power rather than brute force. Relaxed power is the phrase to carry forward, because relaxation is the first casualty when an athlete stops trusting a joint. Compare that against where his serve sat before the American swing began. Roughly 66% of first deliveries were landing. Around 74% of those points were being won, with 58% converted behind the second ball. Service games were held at a rate near 87%, alongside about 4.5 aces per match against 2.5 double faults. Perfectly respectable numbers for a top 10 player, yet nowhere close to intimidating. He compensated through his return game, applying relentless pressure until opponents fractured. Then Cincinnati and New York arrived, and his hold rate climbed toward 97%. The entire economy of his matches shifted. Breaking 3 times per set stopped being necessary. Free points began arriving. Pressure lifted from the rest of his game, and the tennis that followed was arguably the finest of his career. Strip that away, and he reverts to an earlier version of himself, one who must grind for every hold, extend rallies far longer, and spend physical reserves he does not currently possess after 4 months away from competition. Understand as well what the wrist interrupted, because the season had been building towards something remarkable. He opened 2026 in Melbourne and beat Djokovic across 4 sets in the final, 2-6, 6-2, 6-3, 7-5, denying the Serb a record 25th major while completing the career Grand Slam at 22. Nobody had ever assembled the set younger. Nadal, watching from the stands, had been 2 years older when he managed it. A withdrawal from Rotterdam followed, blamed on tiredness, before a title in Doha restored momentum. By the time the clay arrived, he carried a 22-3 record and sat atop the rankings with Sinner breathing on his shoulder, separated by a margin of just 110 points. Then came Monte Carlo, where Sinner beat him in the final and seized the top ranking. Barcelona followed a fortnight later and everything stopped. Alcaraz has already run this experiment once, and the outcome sits in the record books for anyone willing to check. Rewind to May 2024. A different injury, though the same arm. A pronator teres problem, and note carefully where that muscle lives, since it drives the forearm rotation powering every serve, cost him Monte Carlo and Barcelona outright. He returned at the Madrid Open badly undercooked. A 3-set escape against Jan-Lennard Struff consumed close to 3 hours. The following day, he lost the quarterfinal to Andrei Rublev 4-6, 6-3, 6-2, looking mistake-prone and out of sorts as the match slipped away. Afterwards, he said something that ought to be mandatory listening for anybody following the current comeback. He admitted he did not trust the forearm fully. The doubt, by his own account, lived inside his head rather than the tissue. He clarified that he was not playing at a reduced level, merely playing differently, no longer pushing his forehand to 200% because Ferrero had told him such extremes were unnecessary. During that Rublev defeat, he was seen pressing the forearm at a changeover, wearing a long sleeve over the injured arm, and he acknowledged feeling it more that day than in the marathon the evening before. Every time he struck a forehand, he explained, the arm occupied his thoughts. Days later, medical tests revealed muscle edema in that same pronator teres, described by Alcaraz himself as a consequence of the earlier injury. He withdrew from Rome, read the sequence once more, because it overlays the present situation with uncomfortable precision. He was cleared to play. He played regardless. He held back instinctively without meaning to, and he aggravated the surrounding tissue through compensation rather than through the original injury site. That is the genuine hazard waiting in Ohio, and it has almost nothing to do with whether the tendon sheath has healed. Angel Ruiz Cotoro examined him and confirmed the wrist has recovered completely. Take that at face value. The danger lives one layer above, in the forearm musculature and the shoulder, which absorb whatever load a protective player unconsciously redirects away from the joint he is guarding, which delivers us to a contradiction nobody around the sport has managed to resolve. His medical team reports full healing. His camp describes something entirely different. Sources close to the inner circle told reporters he is definitely training, though at very low intensity, with no sets being played and no matches attempted during practice. Rick Maxey, observing from a distance, claimed the reverse. Full fitness restored, practice sets underway. Those accounts cannot both be describing the same week of work. Corrado Barazzuti, a former world number 7, articulated the frustration during an interview with FanPage. The entire episode had become a mystery to him. He traced the timeline aloud. A defeat to Sinner in Monte Carlo, an opening win in Barcelona, a withdrawal the very next day, then silence stretching across 3 or 4 months over a problem nobody in the game had heard mentioned previously. He confessed he could not make sense of it, adding that the wrist is a delicate area for any player, and that the continued vagueness implied something serious. Richard Krajicek voiced a parallel complaint about the shortage of information, having warned earlier that returning prematurely invites obvious danger. 2 former professionals with decades spent inside locker rooms, both admitting they cannot read the situation. That alone indicates how little verified information exists beyond a small building in Murcia. Everything else rushed in to fill the vacuum. Becker declared him far off after studying the same social media clips. Rusetsky forecast absence from New York. Supporters spent days dissecting a wrist wrap glimpsed at a football match. Roddick, to his considerable credit, supplied the mundane explanation. His initial reaction was concern, he admitted, before landing somewhere more sensible. Inside a crowd recovering from a wrist injury, a visible marker functions as a polite request that nobody grab your hand. He was not attending a World Cup final to shake 250 hands, one of them belonging to somebody gripping too enthusiastically. His closing thought carried the real weight, acknowledging that every pair of eyes stays fixed on that arm until the moment Alcaraz walks out and rips a ball in anger. Renee Stubbs, whose contacts run deeper than most, could only relay the word reaching her. He intends to attempt Cincinnati. Her commentary amounted to a shrug wrapped inside conditionals, alongside a practical note that his physical condition should be sound, since a wrist injury permits nearly every form of conditioning below shoulder height, and legs can be trained ferociously regardless. She is correct, and the observation deserves expanding, because it exposes exactly where the gap sits. Fitness is not the binding constraint here. Match sharpness is. Those are separate currencies, and the second cannot be purchased with the first. Someone can arrive in Ohio in outstanding physical shape, yet still find himself half a step late on a return at 30-all. Watch his first serve percentage slide through a tenth-second set and discover that shot. Selection, which felt automatic in January, now demands conscious thought. Competitive rhythm rebuilds through matches alone, and matches are the single commodity his calendar cannot manufacture within the time remaining. Consider what actually awaits him. Cincinnati fields 96 players with the top 32 seeded into first-round byes, meaning he opens against somebody already in form and desperate for the scalp of a returning champion. Every member of the ATP Top 10 entered the event. 43 players in the combined field have won a title during 2026. Sinner arrives having claimed all 5 Masters 1000 tournaments staged this season, sitting on an unblemished record at that level, having completed the career Golden Masters in Rome and successfully defended his Wimbledon crown. Through the grass season, his record stood at 44 wins against 3 defeats across 6 titles, with 6 finals reached and 6 finals won. The scale of that run needs stating properly, since it happened largely while attention was elsewhere. Counting the Paris indoor title from last autumn, he strung together 5 consecutive Masters shields, a feat no player had achieved since the series began in 1990. He became the first man to capture the opening 4 Masters events of any season. Indian Wells and Miami fell without the loss of a single set, making him the first to complete that double untouched. His streak of consecutive sets won at the level reached 37 before Tomasz Machach ended it in Monte Carlo. Rome delivered the 9th and final piece of the Golden Masters collection, achieved at 24 5 years earlier than Djokovic managed the same. There is a scoreboard that captures the reversal neatly. After Melbourne in February, Alcaraz led the big titles count 15-11. By the middle of May, Sinner had passed him. Zverev holds a maiden major from Roland Garros and reached the championship match at the All England Club. Djokovic is entered too, still hunting a 25th. Into that gathering walks a man who has not competed since the middle of April. The arithmetic underneath is harsher than most headlines convey. 4,800 points have already been surrendered during the absence. Rome, Roland Garros, Queens, and the Wimbledon final vanishing in sequence from his tally. A further 3,000 disappear across the next month unless he defends both American titles. His current total rests at 8,160. Zverev sits on 8,480, a margin of merely 320 points. Sinner occupies a different atmosphere entirely at 13,450, having constructed a cushion approaching 5,000 over the German. Seeding is where the damage becomes tangible. Should he reach New York ranked 3rd, the draw deposits him inside Sinner's half. A potential meeting arrives in the semifinals instead of the championship match, against an opponent who has lost 3 times all year and who beat him in the Monte Carlo final in straight sets before any of this unfolded. One additional best-of-5 encounter with the world number 1, inserted a round earlier on the back of 4 months without competitive tennis. The only available lever is Cincinnati. Pulling it requires a deep run at a tournament he has scarcely prepared for, which loops us straight back to the shot everybody's watching. There is a scenario nobody discusses much, and it happens to be the likeliest of all. Not catastrophe, not triumph either, something quieter and considerably stranger. Picture him arriving in Ohio, winning a couple of rounds, serving at 80% of capacity while looking entirely competent, yet lacking the top gear that separated him from everyone last autumn. Then a moment arrives against a genuine contender where the match demands he unload completely, and hesitation flickers for the length of a single heartbeat. His forehand travels at 80% rather than 200. He selects the percentage play instead of the winner. He loses across 3 tight sets, and the consensus declares him fine, merely rusty. That outcome would reveal far more than any withdrawal, because it would confirm the 2024 pattern, repeating with a more serious injury and dramatically higher stakes. His team clearly understands the risk. The reported protocol involves roughly 3 weeks of progressive loading before full-intensity match play, with an expectation that early matches lean heavily on slice, variation, and drop shots rather than raw acceleration. Skipping Montreal purchased 2 additional weeks of preparation. The absence of set play and practice as recently as this month suggests the ramp remains steeper than any public timeline admits. A fair hearing demands the opposite case be put too, because it exists and it is not weak. Mark Pecci, speaking to the Daily Express, argued the enforced break could reset his career favorably. Constant questions had circulated for months about whether Alcaraz still carried the same hunger for the grind, the same appetite for a Tuesday afternoon in a half-empty stadium. Removing tennis entirely tends to restore that appetite quickly. There is a version of this story where he returns refreshed, physically rebuilt, mentally starving, and proceeds to dismantle a field that has been grinding without pause since January while he rested. Bodies recover during layoffs. Sinner has played 47 matches this season and shows no visible wear, yet fatigue accumulates invisibly across the summer, and the American swing has historically punished players carrying accumulated mileage. Alex Corretja captured the mood of the tour bluntly, describing the absence of Alcaraz from the courts as hell for everyone involved. Opponents notice when the most unpredictable competitor in the sport vanishes, and they will notice equally when he reappears. Freshness is a genuine weapon. It simply has never been sufficient on its own to win a Grand Slam, and no player in the modern era has captured a major with a single tournament of preparation behind him after a 4-month layoff. The historical shadow explains that caution completely. Juan Martín del Potro constructed one of the most feared forehands the sport has produced, then spent years fighting his wrist, ultimately unable to sustain a career at the altitude his talent deserved. Dominic Thiem won the US Open, after which a wrist injury quietly dismantled his ability to generate the same tennis, and he retired considerably younger than anybody anticipated. Both stories opened with an injury described as manageable. Both concluded with a player who could still compete, yet never again touched the ceiling he once owned. Alcaraz turned 23 in May. 7 majors already sit behind him. The 7th secured in Melbourne during February, when he beat Djokovic across 4 sets to complete the career Grand Slam, becoming the youngest man in history to assemble the full set at 22 years, 8 months, and 27 days. Before the wrist gave way, he held a 22-3 record for the season, with titles in Melbourne and Doha. His remaining career stretches across decades, provided the arm holds. Measured against that horizon, 1 Masters Shield and 1 Grand Slam defense amount to rounding errors. Rankings refuse to accept such reasoning, however, neither do sponsors. Neither does a rivalry that has generated the most compelling tennis of the decade, one that has now been paused for a third of a season while the sport waits. There is a cruel symmetry buried in the dates that deserves mentioning. Sinner reclaimed the world #1 ranking on the 14th of April, immediately after beating Alcaraz in the Monte Carlo final. That very same day, in Barcelona, Alcaraz was receiving treatment on his right wrist during a first-round match against Otto Virtanen. He won it 6-4, 6-2 while the injury was announcing itself, having felt the joint give way on a return. The following morning he withdrew, telling reporters the problem was more serious than any of them had expected, that he needed to listen to his body, and that he had to prevent it from affecting his future. Everything published since that morning has amounted to interpretation layered on top of an unbroken silence. Rusetsky was not wrong to sound the alarm. He reasoned honestly from the only material publicly available, and he acknowledged as much himself, conceding the footage handed him more questions than answers. Barazzuti was not wrong either. The information genuinely has been scarce. Roddick was probably closest to the truth, and even he ended by admitting that nobody knows anything until the ball gets struck properly. So here is where matters actually stand once the noise clears. The tendon sheath is healed according to the specialist who physically examined it. Nobody outside his immediate circle has watched him serve at full intensity since the 14th of April. Every expert warning issued in the intervenings months has been an interpretation of absence rather than a reading of evidence. The one piece of hard information available, that he entered both Cincinnati and the US Open, and that his name survived the Montreal cut being made, suggests his own team believes he will be ready. Entry lists, though, are not commitments. Names get withdrawn quietly and frequently, often days before a draw. Some analysts have already sketched the darker branch of this decision tree. Should he pull out of Cincinnati, their reasoning runs, the sensible move would be abandoning the remainder of 2026 entirely, skipping New York, forfeiting the title defense, surrendering the points, and rebuilding across a full off-season for a proper assault in 2027. Brutal on paper, yet possibly correct. He would tumble outside the top 5, lose his seeding protection at Melbourne, and hand Sinner an uncontested run at history. Yet he would also arrive next January with a wrist that had been given every chance rather than a rushed one. Nobody inside his camp has hinted at that path publicly. The fact that experienced observers keep raising it anyway tells you how thin the information remains. The answers arrive in Mason, Ohio, on a hard court, in front of cameras that will follow nothing except that right arm. Qualifying opens on the 11th of August. Main draw play begins 2 days afterward. Somewhere inside the opening game of his first match, Alcaraz will toss a ball, rise into a motion he has been rehearsing without contact for roughly 100 days, and finally follow all the way through. When that happens, ignore the first serve. Anybody can swing freely at 40 love with nothing at stake. The revealing moment comes at deuce on a second delivery when a player must trust the wrist to generate spin under genuine pressure. Notice whether he removes pace from it. Study his expression in the second immediately afterward. Track whether the wrap stays on his arm through the following changeover, and whether he flexes the hand between points. The reason a second serve exposes everything is mechanical rather than psychological. Kick and slice deliveries demand more wrist action than flat ones, not less, because spin gets generated by brushing across the ball at an angle while the forearm rotates aggressively through impact. A flat serve can be hit almost entirely with the arm and body if a player is willing to sacrifice margin. Spin cannot. Anyone protecting a wrist will instinctively flatten out the second ball, pushing it safely into the box at reduced speed, which then hands the return to his opponent on a plate. Watch for a second serve average that drops noticeably. Watch too for double faults, since he produced none whatsoever in that US Open final. Watch his forehand too, particularly the running one struck on the stretch, since that shot loads the wrist almost as aggressively as the serve and offers nowhere to hide. One delivery will communicate more than 3 months of podcasts, insider whispers, and freeze-frame practice clips combined. Everything the sport has argued about since April gets settled inside 2 seconds of live tennis, and the man holding the answer has not spoken publicly about his serve even once. If this breakdown handed you something the highlight reels skipped over, hit that subscribe button and switch on notifications, because the instant Cincinnati begins, we are covering every serve, every wrap, and every reaction as it unfolds. Drop your prediction in the comments below. Does he defend the title in Ohio, or does the arm make the decision for him? Tell us what you spotted in that practice video, and let us settle this argument properly downstairs.